And that is one of the most important truths you will ever learn in life. For years, you were taught that being a good person was enough, that if you were understanding, patient, and kind, other people would treat you the same way. But reality doesn't work like that. And Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. He realized that some people don't see your kindness as a virtue. They see it as an opportunity. They don't view your empathy as a strength. They see it as an open door, a tool, a strategic advantage. And if you don't understand this in time, you'll end up handing your peace of mind to people who never intended to protect it. Toxic people don't always arrive shouting. They don't always seem evil. Many times, they appear disguised as someone in need, as a friend, as love, or as someone who cares about you. That's exactly what makes them so dangerous. They don't destroy your life all at once. They consume it slowly. They make you doubt yourself. They make you feel guilty for setting boundaries. They convince you that you're the problem. And while you're trying to prove that you're a good person, they keep taking up more space in your mind. That's why this video isn't about how to change toxic people. That's impossible, because people who enjoy manipulating others rarely want to change. This video is about something far more important: how to stop feeding the very thing that keeps them alive. Here's the secret that almost no one understands. Toxic people survive on the emotional energy they get from others. They need your attention. They need your reaction. They need your explanations. They need your pain, because without those things, they lose their power. And that's where the strategy begins. Imagine this. Someone constantly criticizes you. No matter what you do, it's never enough. They always find something to point out. For years, you try to defend yourself, explain yourself, and prove that you're doing things the right way. But the more you justify yourself, the more power you give them, because you're already playing their game. And the one who controls the game controls the conversation. Machiavelli would have noticed something simple. Never fight on a battlefield designed by your opponent, because you've already lost before the fight even begins. That's why toxic people love emotional arguments. That's where they dominate. That's where they manipulate. That's where they distort reality. They turn your need to be understood into a weapon against you. And here's a harsh truth. You cannot win a psychological battle against someone who enjoys conflict by trying to convince them to be reasonable. Their goal was never to understand you. Their goal was to control you emotionally. The moment you truly understand that, something changes. You stop over-explaining. You stop constantly defending yourself. You stop trying to correct the opinions of people who are committed to misunderstanding you. And believe me, that disarms them far more than any argument ever could, because toxic people expect emotional resistance. They expect tears, they expect anger, they expect endless explanations. What they don't expect is neutrality, because neutrality breaks the cycle. And that brings us to one of the most important ideas in this video. Misguided emotional empathy can become a form of self-destruction. Many people believe that being a good person means tolerating everything, but that's not kindness, that's a lack of boundaries. And a person without boundaries quickly becomes conquered territory. That's why Machiavelli would never have confused compassion with naivety. You can be a noble person without becoming a victim. You can help others without allowing yourself to be used. You can love someone without allowing them to destroy your peace, but to do that, you must accept an uncomfortable truth. Not everyone wants to grow with you. Some people simply want access to you, access to your attention, your energy, your time, and your emotional stability. And once you truly understand that, you stop feeling guilty for protecting yourself. Because protecting your peace isn't selfish. It's your responsibility. Maybe that's why you've met people who seem to create chaos wherever they go. They're always dealing with problems. They're always caught up in conflict. They always have enemies. They always have a new story in which they're the absolute victim. At first, you feel compassion, then confusion, and finally, exhaustion. Because without realizing it, you begin to notice something. The one constant in all of those stories is the same person. And this is where Machiavelli would force you to open your eyes. One of the oldest weapons of a manipulator is making you ignore the evidence right in front of you. They make you doubt your intuition. They make you question your own perception over and over again. And once they achieve that, they no longer need to control you directly. Now you're doing the work for them. That's why toxic people thrive in environments where others are afraid of seeming cold or uncaring. They know that empathetic people take much longer to walk away. They take longer to set boundaries. They take longer to accept the truth. And while they hesitate, they keep giving away their energy. But eventually, something changes. A moment comes when you realize that continuing to explain yourself doesn't help. Continuing to justify yourself doesn't help. Continuing to try to save someone who doesn't want to change is only destroying you. And that's where true freedom begins. Not when you win the argument, but when you no longer need to take part in it. Because the biggest mistake people make when dealing with someone toxic is believing they have to defeat them. They don't. The real victory is simply to stop feeding them. Because when a toxic person no longer has access to your energy, they're slowly forced to face the one thing they've spent years avoiding, themselves. And when that happens, the process they fear most begins, the process of self-destruction. Because many times, you don't have to push someone toward their downfall, you simply have to stop holding them up while they're falling. This is where most people make the mistake that ends up destroying them. Once they realize someone is toxic, they try to change them. They try to make them see reason. They try to show them proof. They try to explain how they're hurting others. And what they get in return is almost always the same. More manipulation, more confusion, more emotional exhaustion. Because you're trying to use logic in a situation that was never based on logic. It was emotional. It was strategic. Machiavelli understood something that many people take years to learn. Not every conflict can be resolved through dialogue. Some are resolved by cutting off access. Because a toxic person depends on one essential thing, your participation. They need you to respond. They need you to defend yourself. They need you to stay trapped in the cycle. Because as long as you keep reacting, they still have power. And here we come to one of the most devastating tools they use, intermittent reinforcement. It's a psychological mechanism so powerful that even casinos rely on it. They give you a little validation, then they take it away, then they come close again, then they disappear. One day they praise you, the next day they ignore you. One day they seem to care about you, the next day they act as if you don't exist. And before long, your mind becomes trapped, because the human brain develops a much stronger obsession with unpredictable rewards than with consistent ones. That's why some people spend years emotionally attached to someone who is destroying them. Not because they're in love, but because they've been conditioned, and that's something much deeper. You're no longer chasing the person, you're chasing the next dose of validation. Once you understand that, you stop blaming yourself. You realize that many toxic relationships function almost like an emotional addiction, an addiction where the reward is never enough. That's exactly why the only way to win is to stop playing. No one beats a slot machine by betting more money. You beat it by walking away. And that brings us to another strategy toxic people use constantly. Triangulation. Maybe you've experienced it yourself. Suddenly, a third person appears. A friend, a coworker, an ex, someone they start comparing you to, someone they use to create insecurity, spark jealousy, and turn the relationship into a competition. Because they understand one thing very well. An insecure person is much easier to control. That's why they constantly create situations where you feel you have to prove your worth, where you have to compete for attention, where you have to prove that you're enough. And the moment you start doing that, you've already lost, because you've accepted a competition that should never have existed in the first place. Machiavelli would have been ruthless about this. Never compete for a place that should already be yours. Because someone who truly values you will never make you fight for scraps of their attention, but toxic people do. Because their goal was never to build a genuine connection. Their goal was to maintain a position of power. And this brings us to something deeply important. Many people believe that toxic relationships destroy your self-esteem, but in reality, they destroy something even more dangerous, your perception. You begin to stop trusting your intuition, you stop trusting your emotions, you stop trusting your own observations, because you're constantly being made to question what you see, what you feel, and what you know. And when someone loses confidence in their own perception, they become incredibly easy to manipulate. That's why one of the greatest victories you can achieve isn't simply walking away physically, it's learning to trust yourself again. It's believing in your inner signals again, because intuition rarely shouts, it whispers. And many times, it was warning you from the very beginning. But your desire to understand, to help, or to save someone was stronger. And that leads us to an uncomfortable truth. Some people don't want help. They want an audience. They don't want solutions. They want attention. They don't want to grow. They want emotional followers. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you'll reclaim your energy. Because there's one thing toxic people hate more than any confrontation: conscious indifference. Not hatred, not anger, indifference. Because hatred still creates a connection. Anger still creates emotional energy. But indifference cuts off the supply. And when someone no longer has access to your emotions, they slowly begin to lose their influence over your life. That's why the hardest people to manipulate aren't the most aggressive. They're the most grounded, the ones who don't react impulsively, the ones who don't feel a constant need to justify themselves, the ones who understand that not every battle is worth fighting. And listen carefully to this. Silence isn't always a sign of weakness. Very often, it's a sign of strength. Because when someone tries to provoke you and gets no reaction, they're forced to face something they don't know how to handle, the absence of control. And that's when their downfall truly begins. Because most toxic people build their identity around emotional influence. They need to feel important. They need to feel feared. They need to believe they can control your emotional state. And once they no longer can, they're forced to confront an enemy far more dangerous than you, themselves. Because for years, they've avoided facing their own wounds, their own insecurities, and their own emptiness. Instead, they've used other people as distractions, as fuel, as mirrors. But when those mirrors disappear, all that's left is silence. And silence reveals everything they've spent years trying to avoid. That's why the real strategy isn't to destroy a toxic person. It's to remove yourself from the dynamic. Because once you stop feeding the cycle begins to consume itself. And then something remarkable happens. You realize that you never needed to win. You only needed to stop losing. And perhaps this brings us to the most powerful truth of all. Toxic people don't fall because someone destroys them. They fall because, sooner or later, they're left alone with the consequences of being who they are. And that's something many people realize far too late. Because when you've suffered at the hands of someone manipulative, selfish, or abusive, part of you wants justice. You want them to see the damage they caused. You want them to suffer the way you suffered. You want them to pay. And it's completely human to feel that way. But Machiavelli would have pointed out something profoundly important. Emotional revenge often benefits your enemy more than it benefits you. Because as long as you're obsessed with destroying them, you're still tied to them. You're still thinking about them. You're still giving them space inside your mind. And that's exactly why the real victory is something entirely different. The real victory is becoming unreachable. Because when a toxic person loses access to your attention, your emotions, and your energy, they lose the very source of power that kept them strong. And that's when something inevitable begins. They start repeating the same patterns with other people, the same lies, the same manipulation, the same mind games. For a while, it may seem like it's working. It may seem like they're still winning. It may seem like they keep moving ahead. But sooner or later, one problem always appears. Patterns leave traces. Eventually, people begin to see what they couldn't see before. Because someone may deceive one person, well, maybe 2, maybe 10, but it's far more difficult to deceive reality for an entire lifetime. That's why many toxic people end up trapped inside the very world they created. Distrust, loneliness, constant conflict, shallow relationships. Because someone who spends years using other people eventually ends up surrounded only by people who know how to use others as well. And that's when trust disappears. Depth disappears, peace disappears. And that's a far quieter form of destruction than any external punishment. Because the real problem was never just what they did to others, it was what they did to themselves. Every act of manipulation weakened their ability to form genuine connections. Every lie chipped away at their credibility. Every betrayal eroded their character a little more. And even if they appear successful on the outside, inside they're trapped in a constant war. Because anyone who needs to control others in order to feel strong never truly learned to master themselves. And that's one of the greatest weaknesses a person can have. That's why Machiavelli would never have confused influence with real power. True power isn't about controlling people. It's about not needing to. A truly strong person doesn't rely on manipulation. They don't rely on mind games. They don't rely on creating fear. Their stability comes from within. And now here's an uncomfortable question. How many times have you mistaken aggression for strength? How many times have you believed someone was powerful when in reality they were simply loud? Because many toxic people seem powerful at first. They speak loudly, they dominate conversations, they intimidate, they manipulate. But if you watch closely, you'll discover something completely different. You'll discover dependence. They need attention. They need validation. They need to feel important. They need to stay in control. And anyone who desperately needs to control something has already lost part of their freedom, because now they're dependent on the very thing they're trying to dominate. That's the paradox. The toxic person appears powerful, but in reality, they're enslaved by their own insecurities. That's why they need to create drama. That's why they need to provoke people. That's why they need to divide others, because external chaos distracts them from the chaos within. And as long as everyone else keeps reacting, they can avoid looking at themselves. But when people begin to walk away, when no one feeds the game anymore, when silence finally arrives, they're forced to face the one thing they fear most, their own reflection. And that's where the real downfall begins, because now they can no longer keep blaming everyone else. They can no longer hide behind new victims. They can no longer use other people's conflicts to escape from themselves. And then they discover something terrifying. The enemy they had been fighting for years was never out there. It was always within. That's why this video isn't really about them, it's about you. Because the most important question was never, how do I make a toxic person destroy themselves? The real question is, how do I stop destroying myself trying to save them, understand them, or fight them? That question changes lives, because it brings your focus back. It gives you your energy back. It gives you your freedom back. For far too long, you may have tried to explain, to justify, to help, to forgive, to understand. And while those things can be noble, they can also become chains when they're directed towards someone who uses your kindness as a tool. That's why the most important lesson in this entire video is simple. Don't feed what destroys you. Don't keep negotiating with someone who survives through manipulation. Don't sacrifice your peace just to win an argument. Don't turn your energy into fuel for someone else's chaos. Because your attention is valuable. Your time is valuable. Your emotional stability is valuable. And not everyone deserves access to it. Sometimes the most powerful decision you can make is to walk away. Not out of fear, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. Because you've realized that some battles aren't won by fighting, they're won by refusing to participate. And when you do that, something extraordinary happens. The toxic person stays the same, but you don't. Now you sleep better, you think more clearly, you live more fully, you breathe more freely, because you've reclaimed something you should never have given away, your peace. And believe me, once someone regains their peace, they no longer need revenge, because they understand that the best response was never to destroy the other person. It was to build a life so strong, so aware, and so free that the thing which once consumed them no longer has any power over them. If this message resonated with you, subscribe and turn on notifications, not to learn how to manipulate others, but to develop a stronger, more self-aware mind that's far more difficult to control. And share this video with someone who's still trapped trying to win a battle they should never have fought. Before you go, leave this comment: I reclaim my peace. Because the day you stop feeding toxic people is the day you begin feeding your own freedom.